Hello to my friends and colleagues and other participants in the International Forum on Spice Route 2025. Just going to share my screen here. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. My name is Peter Lape. I'm from the University of Washington Department of Anthropology, and it's an honor to share some of my research with you today about the spice trade in Maluku, origins and impacts. So I'd like to start by considering some of the reasons we might study the spice trade. I know many of these issues are coming up in this year's workshop, and that's why I'm honored to be part of this larger discussion. So for me, the origins of the spice trade are still mysterious. We don't know exactly when it starts, how, and why. We have a lot of information about later periods of the spice trade, but those earliest origins are still shrouded in mystery. Those networks that connected spice traders hundreds of years ago are still working to connect people today. And so understanding the origins and the history of that network connection can help us understand how people are collaborating and working together in modern times. And finally, the spice trade had a fairly outsized ecological and social impact. And we live with the legacy of those impacts, which will continue to present challenges for us and future generations. So if we turn now to a map like this of global spice routes over the last, say, 1,500 years, you can see there's a lot of detail about the global picture of these routes, but there's not a lot of information about what's going on in island Southeast Asia itself, where many of these spices originated. And this is what I'd like to discuss a little bit more detail today. And I know it's also the subject of many of the talks in the workshop, and of great interest to me. So I'm going to be focusing on the province of Maluku, which is home to two, or depending how you count, three very important spices in the global spice trade: cloves, which come from North Maluku, and nutmeg and mace, which are from the same plant, which come from Central Maluku, and particularly the Banda Islands, shown on this detailed map here. We know there's also other subspecies of nutmeg from other parts of Maluku, but the Banda nutmeg is one I'll focus on mostly today. So turning to our first question, what are the origins of the spice trade? How did it begin? So although we have a lot of detailed documents about the spice trade, starting probably about 2,000 years ago, the origins of the spice trade predate those documents. And so evidence for these origins will have to come from archaeology. I'm an archaeologist, so of course, this is why one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this question. So we have some evidence of early spice trade from the Banda Islands, from the earliest sites that we've excavated in Banda. Both of them are located on Pulo I, which is one of the outer Banda Islands. We have two sites there that are germane to this discussion. The rock shelter site called PA11. Earliest dates are about 7,000 years ago. And then on the right, the Neolithic site PA1, one of several Neolithic sites in the Bandas. Earliest dates there are about 3,500 years ago. So early nutmeg evidence will likely come from archaeobotanical analysis. And here's some pictures of some of that work. Some of my colleagues on the upper picture are spreading out sediments from the Neolithic site to dry. And these are then shipped to the lab. And then on the lower picture are some of my students and colleagues who are analyzing those sediments, looking for microscopic and macroscopic plant remains. But it turns out when we looked for nutmeg, we did not find any evidence of nutmeg in the sediments, but we did find nutmeg residues on earthenware pottery from the Neolithic site. and actually was present on the very earliest pottery found in that site, which dates to 3,500 years ago. So, based on other clues about how that Neolithic site compares to other earlier sites like the rock shelter, we think that it's likely that nutmeg was present in these sites before pottery, but as yet we don't have any direct evidence of that. The reason we think that is because it shows up on the very first pottery. So it seems like it's likely it was there before pottery. So that gives us a sense of, possibly how early spice or nutmeg trading begins, at least 3,500 years ago, probably earlier. Now let's look at some of those early trade networks that connected people through the trade in nutmeg. And so the focus here is on the central and southeast Maluku province, from Seram to the Aru Islands and Tanimbar. Banda is sort of in the middle of this group of islands. And over the past decade or so, my colleagues and I have been working in various places looking for evidence of trade networks. In fact, I'm coming to you today from a pre-recorded video because I'm going to be out in the Gorong Archipelago as we speak, working with colleagues to do some survey in that area. So we have some information about the history of social networks in Maluku from things other than archaeology. For example, we could look at contemporary trade links. This is the right-hand image or map showing about the year 1985 boat trips frequency between different places in Maluku. And you can see um, how the thickness of the line represents the frequency and volume of trade between these places. This gives you a sense of possibilities of trade, how maybe wind and weather patterns influence how places are connected to each other. But of course, that's from recent times. Another line of evidence we can look at is languages. So the central map here shows different language groups in central Maluku. And I'm particularly interested in how Old Bandanese, which is the original language spoken in Banda, no longer spoken there really, is most closely related to the languages of East Seram and Goram, sometimes called the Southeast Seram littoral language group. These languages are very closely related, possibly almost the same, which shows a deep connection between people in these two regions, Banda and Southeast Seram. And then finally, we can look at other historical networks, such as the Pelagandong network, which links villages in alliances throughout Maluku, especially central Maluku. These tend to have a deep history and tell us a little bit about possibilities of connections between places. Archaeologically, I've been focused on studying artifacts that we recover from sites and analyzing their geochemistry, which gives you a fingerprint of where these things are made. And our focus has been on earthenware pottery, which is ubiquitous in archaeological sites starting about 3,500 years ago. There's lots and lots of pottery. Clay and temper used to make pottery is likely very close to the places where it's actually turned into pots. So it gives you an easy way to link between clay sources and village sites. There's also some challenges using pottery. Clay and temper sources can look quite chemically similar. So it requires lots of samples. But on the plus side, the central Maluku area is quite geologically variable. So from place to place, there's a lot of variation in geochemistry, and that helps us distinguish between different sources. So over the past decade or so, we've been collecting clay samples, temper samples, as well as excavated pottery from this area of Eastern Indonesia, from Maluku. So this map shows our current coverage. So the blue dots are actual clay sources, and then the red diamonds are archaeological collections. So there's a lot of information we can get out of these databases. I'll just show you a quick example here. of one thing we can do, which is looking at the connection between three different places. One, a site on Southeast Ceram, and then our Neolithic site on Pulo I, which is the yellow diamond, and then a later period site, the BN1 site on Bandanera Island, which dates to about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. You can see the thickness of the line again represents the closeness of the connection, or the connectedness, as we say. And we can see there's a very close connection between the BN1 site and the Southeast Ceram site. There's a little bit less intense connection between the Neolithic time sites. And there's also a connection between the two sites within Banda. So this is one of the ways that this archaeological data can show us connection. We don't actually maybe have the route, the actual sailing path that people took to go between these places, but it does show us a connection. So there's more data about that. Will be coming out in publications in the near future, so keep your eyes out for that. But I'd like to turn now to our third issue, which is the social and environmental impacts of the spice trade. So if we take a look at the first Dutch records of the Banda Islands, this is from 1599 and also 1602, we get a picture of a place that's been engaged in spice trading now for probably thousands of years, globally, as well as locally. And what the Dutch record is a place in Banda that is very engaged in this trade. It also has considerable amount of conflict. So the Dutch record this inter-village conflict within Banda in 1602. They record the presence of fortifications built up that these are not European forts, but Indonesian-built fortifications or fortified sites. And the Dutch also note the presence of many ethnic enclaves or neighborhoods of foreigners. So people from the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and other parts of Southeast Asia living in Banda for long periods of time. So it's interesting that that already the spice trade hasn't had an impact even before Europeans come into the picture and greatly disrupt this pre-existing trade network. In 1621, the Dutch organize a military invasion of the Banda Islands, which culminates in a massacre of the political leaders of Banda, and then the enslavement or exile of some 90% of the original Banda population. This has a huge impact in the Maluku area. Many people, though many were killed, many others fled or left Banda and settled in new places in Maluku. And to this day, into 2025, people in these places remember their Banda origin. And sometimes their villages are named after Bandanese places. They maintain other social marks of Banda heritage. For example, this group of elders in the village of Rumadan in southeast Ceram. And these people maintain also connections with each other and back to Banda itself, such as the picture on the right here, which shows people in Banda welcoming descendants of refugees from the 1621 massacre to Banda in 2022. So there was also environmental costs to the spice trade, or environmental impacts. One of the things that my colleagues and I are looking at is the impact of fortification building on coral reef ecology. So as noted before, the Dutch noted a lot of indigenous fort building in the late 17th century, but the Europeans came in and also built massive fortifications and other kinds of buildings, primarily out of coral block. These coral blocks would have been taken from nearby coral reefs and must have had an outsized impact on coral reef ecology, fish populations, as well as impacted on things like coastal erosion and other factors. So some of my paleoenvironmental colleagues are studying, seeing if we can measure those impacts by taking samples of corals and looking at changes in sea chemistry, sea surface temperature, and other factors to see if we can evaluate the environmental cost of the spice trade. And finally, we can't avoid mentioning, of course, the environmental costs of global capitalism, which, especially once Europeans enter the picture, things like the Dutch East India Company are capitalist enterprises where people from far away control the fate of people in distant locations, and often in pursuit of profits without considering other social or environmental impacts. So this is another factor that we should consider. How that plays out today, I think, if you look at Banda now, it is still a place where nutmeg is grown and people make money off selling nutmeg to the global spice markets. It's also a great place for fishing, and it's an important tourist destination. And there's a lot of work being done now to try to balance how tourism, which is people coming primarily to look at the remnants of the colonial spice trade, how that balances economic stability for people who live in Banda and the physical cultural heritage of this history. So I wonder, can what we know about spice roots and social connections from the spice trade help sustain these communities into the future? So really, it's a question of who gets to decide what kinds of master plans or what kinds of tourist controls take place in places like Banda. So I think I'll wrap things up with that. I'm sorry I can't be with you to answer any questions you might have, but I invite you to email me at any time. My email address is shown here on the screen. You can also go to my website to download any of my publications. And I'd like to end just by thanking the organizers for the International Forum on Spice Route for the kind invitation to present today, my colleagues at Bryn, and many other partners who have worked with me over the years, our funders, and our many community participants who welcomed us to conduct fieldwork in their communities over the past years, as well as the field crews who joined me.